things. Okay, but I will start off by reading inside the Sefer Chinuch because he has, I think, some very interesting insights that foreshadow sort of a modern response to adultery and the consequences of adultery. So if you're following along, it's mitzvah number 35. He calls it not to have immorality with another's wife, the galot ervata eshet ish. Right, not to commit adultery with another man's wife. By the way, just before we even get into the topic itself, some people might be bothered by the fact, and we perhaps understand why this is so, but still nevertheless could be bothered by it, that there is a difference of how halacha treats men and women with this in regards to this, that it's considered adultery if a man has a relationship with a married woman, but not necessarily vice versa. Right? If a single woman has a relationship with a married man, it's not considered adultery because men, biblically speaking, were allowed to have more than one wives, and only with the time of Rabbeinu Gershom does it become a problem.
But it is by his wife.
Yes, his wife, right, would not necessarily hold in the lenient positions in this regard. And by the way, that's a very important element inside the Sefer Chinuch. The Sefer Chinuch talks, and we'll see this in a little bit, that one of the motivations of not committing adultery has to do with what it does to the family unit. So therefore, even if it's permitted halachically, so to speak, if it destroys the family unit, that's the major concern, at least the Sefer Chinuch, and we'll see that in just a moment. But I'd like to also point out that even before Rabbeinu Gershom, in the time of Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he also found this sort of distinction somewhat problematic. When he moves to Yavne, the Sanhedrin moves to Yavne after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is leading the community in Yavne, and he comes up with a number of different innovations to hopefully keep the community going. The most famous one, of course, has to do with shofar, right? After the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Until then, for example, Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbat. What do we do with the shofar? So in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, we blew shofar on Shabbat. It's only after the destruction, the Mishnah says that we become fearful that people will carry the shofar and they'll carry other things, and therefore they'll violate Shabbat, and so therefore we no longer blow the shofar on Shabbat when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbat. But in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, you would blow it, certainly at least in the Beit HaMikdash area itself. So Rabbi Yochanan says, the truth is, I believe that should be blown any place that is considered Mikdash, but not Medina. Medina is the general public. Mikdash is the holy point within the community. And so he says, since Yavne is the seat of the Beit Din, of the Sanhedrin, this counts as Mikdash, and so therefore we should blow shofar in Yavne, even if we don't blow on Shabbat, even if we don't blow shofar in the rest of the country. By the way, this principle that he introduces, over the years, for example, in 1967, there were a large group of individuals who moved to the Old City and said we should continue to blow shofar now on Shabbos, at least in the Old City. And in fact, my understanding is they still, even though the temple's not there, but we now have.
No, but I mean specifically because the temple.
No. Meaning we don't blow shofar right now as a general rule on Shabbat. Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbat. But the idea of the 6-day war and sort of regaining sovereignty over the entire Old City and the Temple Mount was considered so significant, perhaps it's like in the time of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, where he blew shofar on Shabbat in Yavne, so even without a Beit HaMikdash, but in a united Yerushalayim. And my understanding is that there are still, if you go to the Old City on Rosh Hashanah on Shabbat, they don't do it overly public, but there are a few shuls that close their windows and blow shofar on Shabbat based upon this teaching of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai in Yavne. Yes? Well, you wouldn't, no. So he doesn't say that. He says it has to be still in Eretz Yisrael because it has to have the definition of Mikdash, which for him is connected to Eretz Yisrael. But it's an interesting question. The wrong kind, right? He had another major innovation as well. He declared that we should do away with the sota ceremony, right? The sota ceremony, a man suspects his wife of indiscretions. She has to, right? We know the whole ceremony. He says we should no longer do it. And his reasoning was, His reasoning is exactly what I just mentioned. The distinction that the Torah has for men and women with regards to adultery, he says it's not appropriate. What's his source for making a distinction? So in the prophet Hosea, it's written as follows. Hashem says the Jewish people are off the right path. They're doing a whole series of lecherous impulse, and they're going in the wrong direction, and all these things. They sacrifice on the mountaintops, al roshei ha'arim yizbachu, the al givaot yikateru, and they bring the incense on the hills, underneath the alone, the trees, and they're doing all these terrible things because there's a wonderful shade there. And then he goes on and says, and the daughters of the Jewish people are fornicating, and your daughters-in-law are committing adultery. Lo efkod et benotechem. I am not going to punish, this is Hashem speaking, according to the prophet Hosea, I am not going to punish your daughters, even though they're engaging in inappropriate sexual behavior, and your daughters-in-law who are engaging in adultery, I'm not going to punish them as well. And why am I not going to punish them as well? Because you, and now he's referring to the men, you men are going and you're sacrificing to the temple prostitutes of other pagan religions, and you are going to prostitutes, and you're committing adultery and all these different things, and therefore, if you're going to be doing all these things, how can I create a different standard? And the Ibn Ezra says on that verse, he says, the reason why God says I'm not going to punish is because God can't stand the hypocrisy, and therefore, because of that hypocrisy, God will, in a sense, washes his hands of the whole thing, kiviyachol, and based on that teaching, not the Ibn Ezra's, but the Hosea, it seems Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai also felt that there shouldn't be a distinction in terms of, now there is in terms of halachically and the punishments involved, but in terms of hashkafically, there shouldn't be any distinction whatsoever at looking at this. Yes? So they would then have to go back to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, right? They could go back to Rabbi Yochanan. Right. Rabbi Yochanan, everyone accepts, although, again, all he did was dismiss the sota process. Meaning he basically says, we're not going to, in a sense, punish the women in the same way God chooses not to punish the women, but he still holds that it's inappropriate. Okay, so with that, just one caveat, we'll continue with the reading of the Sefer HaChinuch. He says that you are not to lo tin'af. The details of this mitzvah actually appear much more so in Acharei Mot. We're now in Yitro. I know we just passed Acharei Mot in real life, but in the virtual world, we're still in Parshat Yitro, and he says you'll get more details here. This is the warning. And then, as always, he gives us the shorshei ha-mitzvah, the roots of this mitzvah. So what are the reasons why you should not engage in adultery? At the root of this precept lies the purpose that the world should be settled as the eternal Lord desired. This is the same language, if you remember, that God uses, according to Sefer Chinuch, for Pru Urvu, the mitzvah of Pru Urvu. Also for the mitzvah we saw just a little while ago of do not murder, right? The world should be inhabited, so don't murder. We also saw it with relations to the mitzvah of honoring one's parents, that parents were viewed as the bridge from one generation to the next and passing along the teachings of God and Torah, and so therefore also the world should be settled along those lines. So it's a continuous theme that he has. And the Lord, blessed be he, wished that everything in this world should produce its fruit. This is the innovation of the Sefer Chinuch, which I think is very interesting, that we should produce its fruit, offspring, each according to its species, and no one species should become intermingled with another. What is he alluding to, right? Like kilayim and things along those lines, shotness even mixing. He's taking that mitzvah and he's applying it to the prohibition of adultery. What's the issue here? Why is there a relationship between the two? That if someone engages in adultery and has a child, so no one knows who that father really is. And he's suggesting, therefore, we learn from that species should not become intermingled with another. So too it is about a human child. It should always know and be known whose child this child is. And they should not become intermingled with one another. So that's his first reason. He's going to give a second reason in a minute. But the reason I found it very interesting is he basically is arguing one of the reasons why adultery is problematic is because of the result of the mamzer, which we'll talk more about, and not knowing who your father is. And the reason why it's so interesting is because just recently there's been a slew of academic papers coming out about not the dangers of growing up in a single family. That also exists, and we'll look at some of those studies in just a little bit, but not knowing who your parent is. In fact, they've just passed a number of laws in Australia and America, things that calls it a human right to know who your parent is. In fact, this came and changed a lot of, it usually comes up with the conversation with regards to adoption law, right? For the longest time in America and most countries, there was a closed adoption system that a parent was allowed to give up a child for adoption and sort of protect their privacy. Now, in all these countries, the laws have changed, and they're more or less called open adoption systems, that the child should be able to find out who his parents are. And the original arguments were primarily issues of health, right? You should know if, God forbid, you have some genetic disease, and you should be able to know who your parent is in that regard. But it's developed, and it's actually now a international human right, that it's called part of your narrative. Knowing who you are, where you come from, is a human right. And it's a basis for sort of healthy living. There's an actual psychological disease called genealogical bewilderment. Genealogical bewilderment is you don't know where you come from, you don't know who your ancestors are, and it actually is considered a psychological detriment to your existence. I don't want to sort of emphasize it too much, but you can see this in the positive as well. There was a book that came out not too long ago called How to Build Strong Families.
What's the name?
How to Build Strong Families. I think the author is Bruce Fielder. And he gives all these ideas and suggestions and research of the importance of families and how you build strong families. And it's one of those books I regret having read, because it's a brilliant book, but I shared it with my wife, and now we have to follow along a lot of the things that he suggests. So, for example, he suggests that you should have a family motto. You get together for a motto, and you say, what is your family really all about? And we picked, don't be lazy, which is a big problem, because now whenever you want to be lazy, my daughter created a little thing from clay, and we hang it on our thing that says, don't be lazy. So it's very hard for a parent to be lazy if that's your motto. We also have family meetings now, once a week. Just discuss anything that's going on and make plans. And of course, the one who wants to violate the family meetings is me, and so I feel bad about that as well. But one of the things he said was very interesting, and we did this actually at our Seder one year. He says that children who score high on a certain test, and there's 20 questions in the test, it has been proven over a sort of a longitudinal study of many, many years, have been much more successful in school, in health, a whole series of different things. What were the questions on this test? The questions on this test was basically questions of how well you know your family history. So there were questions like, do you know how your parents met? Do you know which high school your parents went to? Do you know how your grandparents met? Do you know a story about your great-grandparents? All these different things, 20 different questions. And kids who got like 15 or above, and this was the amazing thing, they looked and they saw that they did much, much better in a whole series of real-life tests. And he suggests the reason why is as follows. By the way, the reason why it's a little bit dangerous thing, we did this at our Seder, as I mentioned, and my parents were here, and my wife's parents were here, and we tested the kids. Do you know where your parents met? And it was great. The kids had their story, and then the husbands had their story of how they met, and then the wives had their story of how they met, and none of them were the same. But it was a great experience just to go around talking about sort of family history. And the reason why they argue it's important is because, for example, if you're having a tough time in school, or you're in the beginning of your first career, let's say, and you're having a tough time, a challenge with this. Well, if you knew that your grandfather, had actually went bankrupt, but then after the bankruptcy came back and was able to build a business, or if you know that there were other challenges, or you know that there were other successes, there's something called intergenerational wisdom, meaning not just the wisdom you live sort of divorced from everything that's come before you, but you're a part of everything that's come before you. And you can draw inspiration that if someone before you, as part of your family, overcame challenges, so that's part of your inheritance. You know that you can do so as well. And children who have that knowledge and know how their parents met and know the schools they went to and know that they had certain experiences and you can have these experiences as well. So these actually strengthen the kids' outlook as they went forward going towards life. So not knowing these things, right, sort of the being a mamzer is an extreme case of that. Not knowing where you come from, your history, it deprives you of some real great strengths going through life. Yes? Right. So that, by the way, that's also raised in many of the articles that sort of convinced states, like American law, for example, to change, was that particular issue, meaning not mamzerut per se, but the problem is, one is the health issue. If you don't know who your parents are, you don't know what your genetic makeup and composition is. Secondly is that you may end up exactly, marrying someone who, is your blood relative in some way. And then the third thing, as I mentioned, was this sort of psychological, genealogical bewilderment concern, psychological things. And the literature goes on to describe children who don't know where they come from. Now, of course, these are generalities. There's many, many major exceptions to everything I'm saying. But these generalities that showed that they had a higher percentage of sort of feeling excluded from other children, feeling a little bit ostracized. And as I'm reading the academic literature, it strikes me that this is exactly what the mamzerut laws produced, right? That you're feeling ostracized, that you're separate of the community. It's almost as if the laws of mamzerut were describing a physical reality that might be produced nevertheless. Yeah.
This may also impact on anti-Semitism.
Yeah, how so?
Because we really know
Mm.
we know our history,
Right.
and things of this sort, and we know if you, the Gentile, are currently reproducing that history, so we know that.
Right. Well, we do talk about this concept of, right, ma'aseh avot siman lebanim, that which our ancestors were engaged in. We have those same kochot, right? So if you can hear that history, right, and you can then know that you have it as well. Yeah, it has the similar ideas. So that's the first thing that the Sefer Chinuch says, is that be wary of the problem of adultery, is that it's connected to the family, that you potentially produce mamzerim, and there's a great danger in that. We're going to come back to that. At the end of the class, I want to share with you an interesting case that happened here in Israel that actually speaks about a mamzer here in Israel. Okay, so the second thing, Sefer Chinuch goes on to say, after he talks about this idea of knowledge, V'od yimtza'u hefsedim kama b'ne'uf. There are many, they translate it as harmful results, many things that are lost that will follow from adultery. It will be the cause of transgression of several obligations which God has imposed upon you. Thus he commanded us about honoring our parents. They will not be recognized by the children where there was adultery, right? The child can no longer be engaged in honoring one's parents. There will be a further disaster about which we are equally commanded, not to be conjugally intimate with your sister, right? There is the same concern here. Again, they're focusing on the question of the relations of the mamzer. All will be uprooted, overturned on account of adultery. You won't recognize your female relatives. In addition to that, there's a form of theft with adultery. Also, in addition to that, there's a loss of human life, because it is a known fact that human nature, people grow jealous over adulterous relationships. And so therefore there will be fighting between people, may lead to death. And it's not just fighting between let's say the two wives or the two men. It disrupts entire families. You're right, inside. Even if people don't get divorced, there's the fighting that the children witness. And if they do get divorced, that also then becomes a major thing. In the time of the Sefer Chinuch, divorce was relatively rare. Today, it's incredibly commonplace. And one of the results of that is children being raised in single-family homes. And here the literature is unbelievable. I mean, I only had to do a quick Google search, and I got hundreds. And by the way, I got documents from what we would call conservative think tanks, like the Heritage Foundation, that speaks about, children raised in single-family homes, for example, the increase of, let's say, 10% in the increase of single-family homes produces in the same area a 17% increase in juvenile crime. And on and on and on. It's not just in terms of crime, it also has to do with in terms of health of the children raised. There's a much higher rate of whole series of different diseases when a child is raised in a single family. Again, lots of exceptions to all what I'm saying, but as a general across society, much higher rate of a lot of different diseases, emotional diseases, physical diseases, exposure to a lot of different challenges. And ultimately, as I said, in the time of the Sefer Chinuch, this is fairly rare. Today, where it's very popular, it's not just a problem for that particular individual child, but rather for all of society. Society, on some level, is collapsing because of the lack of strength within the family unit. And one of the things the Sefer Chinuch goes on to say is the whole essence of this mitzvah is about family. It goes back to honoring one's parents. It's all about sort of creating a connection to God, and the family unit is the means by which many of these values are transmitted. If you destroy the family, you destroy the connection to Torah. And we see that. We see that it's not just the problem of being raised in the single family, it's the problem that there's all these potential values are no longer transmitted as a result. Yes?
May I ask you,
Yes.
I'm a single girl.
Yes.
I have this boyfriend, let's call it, and I say to my parents, this is my boyfriend, and they say no, am I obligated?
So it's an interesting question. We actually touched, I don't know if we touched upon it, but it was one of the things I wanted to say if I didn't touch upon it, in the class on honoring one's parents. There were 3 exceptions. You have an obligation to honor your parents, except in 3 instances. One is if you want to make aliyah, and they say no. 2 is you want to learn in a certain Torah environment, and they say no. And 3 is if you want to marry someone, and they say no. So if you like that boyfriend, your parents are still opposed? I'm just kidding. You don't have to listen to them in this regard. Who remembers? Yes.
You read all the time that not religious people who the spouse has a lover and they murder the spouse, they murder the lover, or they
Yeah.
murder both of them.
It happens. It happens. By the way, this is an aside, but it's a beautiful story. I hadn't thought to tell it, but when you mentioned what you just said, our downstairs neighbors in Nachalot were this couple who were from South Africa. And we went downstairs when we first met them, and they told us the following story. They had just gotten married, but they were already in their, I think, 50s, 60s. And said, how did you meet and everything like that? And apparently, it started off as this tragic story. They actually knew each other as teenagers. They, in fact, were, boyfriend and girlfriend. He was from the wrong side of the tracks, from a poor neighborhood, and he started, writing letters and calling, and the mother of the girl refused to tell her that he was calling, that he was writing letters. He would stop by, knock on the door. She said he's not home. Anyway, this went on for a year or 2, whatever it was. They were in different schools, and the mother said she doesn't want to see you ever again. Please stop all these things, and he stopped. Independently, they both made aliyah to Israel. They both married. One of them, others. One of them got divorced. And the other, his wife was killed in a terrorist attack that was actually publicized in the newspapers, everything like that. And when she read this in the newspaper, she realized, first of all, that he lives in Israel. She had never known. And even though she felt very hurt from, 30, 40 years later, what her mother said that, he never called, he never came back, she thought they were going to get married. And he just disappeared. She felt like she should at least go to the Shiva house. And at the Shiva house, they talked, and he, let it slip, or she let it slip, saying, I'm just curious, we've moved on. Why did you never call me? And he said, why did you never? And it all came out, everything about the mother standing in the way. And actually, after the Shiva, and then after the Shoshim, not long after that, they were married, because they already knew each other, and they ended up living, a very nice life together. And these are our downstairs neighbors. No, I don't believe so. Okay, so the Sefer Chinuch goes on as I said, and he talks about all these additional dangers that happen as a result of destruction of the family. Meaning, the Sefer Chinuk's primary concern is about the development of family. That's his focus on this particular mitzvah. Others don't. Others focus on different ideas. What I thought to do is to talk sort of some theological ideas, what might be underpinning the fact that this is included in the Ten Commandments. What's really behind it? And there's 2 or 3 ideas that I want to suggest, and then, as I said, move it out of the biblical realm to a practical rabbinic case that took place more recently. So the first thing that I would talk about is to see adultery as sort of a reflection of the primordial sin, that exists in the entire world. What sin or what emotions, what experience underlies all of our sins? And to do that, you have to go back to the Garden of Eden. And when you go back to the Garden of Eden, what was the sin of eating from the tree? So if you look at the text itself, what does it say about Chava? It says she looked at it, she saw it, and she wanted it. It looked good to her, and she wanted it. It's connected to sight. It's connected to taking something that you want. And there's a movie called Noah. I haven't seen the movie, but sort of a modern-day adaptation of the story of Noah. And I did see the trailer once, and it shows every time before there's a major sin, a sin of murder, a sin of adultery, a sin of robbery. There's always the fruit, meaning that's the sign of the temptation. And it's the temptation of seeing something, wanting it, and taking it. And then it's forbidden. Yeah, maybe that it's also forbidden. I would say forbidden is connected to the idea that it's not yours. Right? To a certain extent, what does forbidden mean? Right? It's not for you. It's not designed for you. The B'nai Elohim, right? It says they saw the daughters, and they took it. If it was for them, designed for them, so then there's no real sin. It's the sin that it's not really yours. The way we describe that in modern language is selfishness, right? Believing that the world revolves around you, that everything is for you, and you can't even imagine something being forbidden because that means it's not designed for you. There's limitations on what you can have in this world. It would be theft. Well, it's the same idea, meaning, but that's also what's underlying murder. That's also what's underlying adultery. It's seeing something that's not yours and taking it. Lo tachmod. It's right. Well, we'll get to that exactly. Right. These are similar themes. That's the real problem is this selfishness, and you can see it in adultery in particular. I was reading this article by this young person who turns to his father right before he's getting married. And he says, he's really excited about getting married and this wife, he loves her and everything, but he's a little bit nervous about, what he's going to give up. And does his father have any advice for him? And his father says to him, maybe marriage isn't for you. And he says, he's taken back a little bit. And he says, what do you mean? He says, well, marriage isn't for you. Not in the sense it isn't for you personally, but marriage isn't ever for you, meaning it's never for the person who's getting married. It's for the other person. It's for you to learn how to give, right? If we go all the way back to the very beginning, when we talk about pru'ervu, the mitzvah of pru'ervu, of having children, was to teach us what does it mean to become a giver. Because the moment we learn how to become a giver, we're born not as givers, we're born as takers, right? That's the child. And it's not even an immoral thing, right? When a child cries in the middle of the night at 3 a.m, right? I'm now talking from recent personal experience. They're being selfish, but not because they're being bad. It's just that's human nature. And that's the point. Our human nature, from birth, is to be selfish.
But even if I'm older, if I'm your wife and
Yeah.
I'm in big pain, so this pain is what's important
To you. But what marriage is trying to teach us is to go beyond. In the same way having a child is to go beyond, marriage is also about, it's not for you. Meaning the reason why you entered into this is to learn what it means to become a giver, because once you can become a giver, that's how you emulate God. The whole concept of creation of the world is God did not need anything, and God decides to give a gift to the world. So the fundamental way of emulating God is to learn how to be a giver. And that's one of the things that marriage does. It teaches us how to give, and that's one of the things that adultery destroys. It basically says, I'm not going to give to this particular person, but rather I am going to take something that's not mine and taking from someone else in those regards. When you spoke about your hurting, it reminded me of the story of Rabbi Aryeh Levine. It's a very famous story where he goes to the doctor. Yeah, he says, our foot hurts, right? Because he feels so intimately connected in that regard.
Yeah,
So
but the infant is helpless, and that's natural.
it's natural, and that's why and that's what's beautiful about it. It sheds an insight into human nature without judging. That's who we are, naturally. So it's not even saying it's a negative, but it's saying that's who we are naturally, and we are going to change. Think about the early mitzvah. The early mitzvah are about changing something that appears impossible to change. Pruvu, I already spoke about the idea that we become givers. The second mitzvah was Brit Milah. We physically change, right, who we are. The fourth mitzvah was Kiddush HaChodesh, about believing that an entire nation can change, right? Seeing the moon, it says, Chodesh Hazeh Dugma Lechem, this moon, the way it sort of waxes and wanes, becomes different, is a symbol for you, the Jewish people, that you too can change. Meaning, the Torah is again and again emphasizing the point that we are born one way, but that is not our destiny. We have the ability to change. And here too, with marriage, we're being trained of how to change in this regard.
First point on change.
I would say that it's the pru or vu, becoming a parent, learning how to give, which is not natural either. It's not natural to give. It's natural to take.
You don't know what's involved even. Well,
Right. The one thing I was going to sort of summarize this particular point, this theological point, is with the story of Yosef, right? Yosef, when he refrains from engaging in adultery or the temptation with Eshet Potiphar, the commentaries point out that he doesn't necessarily even view it as a sort of a sexual temptation or a sexual sin, but rather it would be a sin against God, right? That up until now, Yosef has been relatively self-centered. And this statement, this act, which transforms everything going forward, is him not being self-centered, saying, it's not for me, my whole world is not for my own personal benefit, but rather it is for others, ultimately for God. No, right. So that's why it's
No, but it's still not considered.
because it's non-Jewish.
No, not because of that. Is
Oh,
adultery two married people?
No. So that's the initial point. The single man, I mean, it is adultery in his behalf because she's married.
So he would be committing adultery.
He would be committing adultery. Now, the question is whether or not it applies the same way, Jewish or non-Jewish. By the way, it's interesting to note that adultery, more or less, is the same for Jews and non-Jews because it's one of the 7 mitzvot that are commanded upon the Noach.
Jewish girl or shiksa is
Well, it's interesting when you have cross-religion adultery, but what I mean to say is in the non-Jewish community, adultery is the same. And by the way, we can understand that actually, if we understand the Sefer Chinuch, it makes perfect sense. Because if there's adultery and there's not a strong family unit, like to a certain extent, I don't really care if non-Jews are eating bacon. Right? I mean, maybe on one level I care or whatever like that, but it's not really my business, so to speak. If God says they can eat bacon, they can eat bacon. Why do I care if they're committing adultery or not? Well, once you understand it as it can potentially destroy a family, which in turn can destroy an entire society, that society eventually, and the negative effects of that society will eventually wash over and have an impact on me as well, on all of us. So it's one of the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. The one exception or distinction you might be as follows, that marriage officially takes place according to the laws of the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach after conjugal rights. In Judaism, you can have Kiddushin, right? You can become engaged, and then you are technically married, even if you haven't yet lived together. So that's the major distinction in that regard. But with regards to Yosef, we do see that he is sort of views this as a religious act, a hakarat tov, right? That he says, first of all, look at everything this Potiphar has not withheld from me, and it would be a sin against God, right? It's a lack of sort of appreciation to God. I just want to add this one. Right. So in the previous 5 commandments, we had spoken about these were ben adam lemakom mitzvot, right? Shabbat, but they all had a ben adam lechavero component. Here we're going vice versa. Here is clearly a ben adam lechavero mitzvah that has a ben adam lemakom element, and you see that with Yosef. And Yosef also sort of provides a bridge for the next element, that he sees this as connected to God. That's the second major theological element of adultery. What sin is adultery almost always connected to? I'll give you a hint. The Midrash says that when the Jews are at Har Sinai, and at that point in time they begin to engage in idol worship, the Midrash says that it's as if a bride is committing adultery underneath the chuppah, right? Meaning the Midrashim, the rabbis compare very strongly adultery and idolatry, that there's a similar idea there. And you can see, by the way, in the structure of the 10 Commandments themselves. The structure of the 10 Commandments, we spoke in the very first class about how there's a lot of different ways to draw them. One of them, of course, is just to go look at the Ben Adam L'Chavero to the Ben Adam L'Makom. And if you do that, adultery is connected to have no other gods before me, right? There's a sort of exclusivity cause, and therefore learning how to develop a relationship with one's spouse and have this closeness helps us also to develop the sense of closeness and exclusivity with God as well.
Yosef has an image of his, a vision of his father.
Yes.
What does that have to do with him? How does that stop?
How does that particularly... well, that's... Yeah.
He saw his father's image in his mind.
Right.
It was like, don't look at this temptation.
Right. Well, one is we go back to honoring one's parents. Part of honoring one's parents is really just as a tool to learn how to honor God, that they're the vehicle. They remind us of everything that's come before. By the way, on that particular midrash, there's a very sort of a short explanation. It says that he looks in the mirror and he sees himself. And he realizes that all those years in prison, he's changed. And he actually sees his father, right? Eventually, we all see our parents in ourselves. So that's one of the things that takes place as well. So one of the things I just want to add to that, once you make that connection, that adultery is like idolatry, there's 2 additional things that I think we have to say. One is, what is the cause of idolatry? Because that might also shed light into what one of the causes is of adultery. So one of the causes of idolatry, if we go to example for that particular case at Har Sinai, right, Moshe goes up. What causes the people to want to have his absence? He said he'll be down in 40 days, and he's 1 day late, or they miscalculated. But whatever it is, it's just a little bit. It's the lack of patience. It's the lack of faith that Moshe's coming back. That, more than anything else, I would suggest, causes sort of is the motivator of adultery to a certain extent. They're unfaithful beforehand, before even being unfaithful, meaning, what is faith? Faith is believing in something that you can't see, but knowing that it's there. One of the things I do with kid groups all the time when I talk about God is I ask them to, I'll have a child sitting next to their mother, and I'll say, I want you now to touch the chair next to you. And they touch the chair. And I say, I want you now to touch your mother's elbow. And they touch the elbow. I want you now to touch your mother's cheek. And they touch the cheek. And I say, now I want you to touch your mother's love for you. And they can't touch it. And I say, but does it exist? And they say, of course. And I say, God's similar in that regard, that even when you can't touch something doesn't mean it's not there. In fact, very often it's the strongest thing that exists. And so, in the same way, having faith in one's spouse is, even when you don't see them doing something for you, to know that they have your best intentions at heart. to believe that they're trying to do these things. When people stop thinking that their spouse is trying to help them, that's when they feel rejected. And sometimes it's unfortunate, it's just a mistake. There's a book called The Five Languages of Love. Five Languages of Love by a guy by Chapman is the individual. It's a very interesting book. He basically has a very simple way of explaining marital relations. He says that we each speak a different language of love, how we feel affirmed and loved by our spouse. He says some people, for example, the way you speak to them is words of affirmation. I really appreciate what you did for me. Thank you for doing this. Words of affirmation. That's what I need to hear. Others is quality time. The person spends time with me. That's how they express love. Another way is gifts or acts of service. I took out the trash. I did these things. I give a gift to you all the time. There's five different types. And he says the problem is that sometimes spouses don't know what their language of love is or what their spouse's language of love is. And so it's as if you're speaking Chinese and Dutch. You'll have a tough time communicating. So here's one person who says, the husband, he's taking the trash out nonstop. And every time he does that, he's saying, I love you, to his wife. His wife, however, her language of love are words of affirmation, or quality time, or physical touch. Or a gift, right, exactly. So he tells the story of a man who never once bought a gift for his wife because he never liked getting gifts. So he assumed his wife would. But of course, that mistake, she felt totally unloved throughout their entire relationship. And then he said, you know what? And they were ready to get divorced. And so Chapman tells them, he says, just for 1 week, get a gift he gets the smallest gifts every single day. In 1 week, everything was transformed because she heard all of a sudden, oh, he's always been saying I love you, but he's saying it in Chinese. Now he's saying it in English, and I actually understand what he's saying. And so part of the challenge of a good relationship is finding out what your language of love is, finding out what your spouse's language of love is, and then actually speaking that language. If you don't know those languages, so then it's all on faith, right? I have to assume that they really care for me. But if you do the research, it's no longer, you don't have to rely on faith. You can actually hear it and then provide these type of things. But that's part of the issue, is this lack of patience, believing that something is going to come, that the person is trying to do. You know, when we judge ourselves, we almost always judge ourselves favorably because we know all the, extraneous factors of why we made a particular decision. When we judge other people, we almost always judge them negatively because we only see their actions. So part of the challenge within a relationship is to begin to judge your spouse as you would judge yourself. Seeing all the things that normally are not available to see. That's what faith is about in that regards. The second thing that this idolatry comparison, I think, connects us to, is the concept of an intermediary, right? An intermediary. When Moshe comes down, he smashes the tablets. At the end of the Torah, right, Rashi tells us that it was good that Moshe smashed the tablets, because if he didn't smash the tablets, the Jews might have started worshiping the tablets. And there can't be any intermediary between us and God. By the way, that's one of the attractions of Christianity, for example. Christianity. And I'm saying this in a positive way. The Jewish people themselves, the Torah tells us that the direct relationship, the direct honesty between the Jewish people and God is terrifying. When you stand before God vulnerable, naked, totally open, right? They say we can't take it. It's too intense when God speaks to us directly. Moshe, you do it. Christianity kind of institutionalized that and says, we're going to give you a human, half God, that will be your intermediary, that you don't have to relate directly. Judaism says, no, you have to have this very powerful, but it's also a frightening relationship where you reveal everything to God, and in the same thing, that's what marriage is. You hand everything over. One of the advantages, this is on tape, so I hope they take the whole context. I was going to say, one of the advantages of adultery is that you could be superficial, right? Yeah, don't cut it there. You could be superficial with another person. it's, if you don't want that intensity of the relationship, you don't have to be vulnerable. You don't have to be open, right? It's purely physical as opposed to inside the spousal relationship. So there's another lesson we learn with regards to the connection of adultery and idolatry. And I would just point out that if we think about the Ten Commandments, I said one way of connecting them is like this, the other is diagonal. So if you do diagonal, right, so then the first would be with the 10th, second with so forth. So here, this mitzvah, not adultery, would be connected to Shabbat. And there's a parallel in that regard. Shabbat is, in a sense, a haven, right? It's kind of like who you really are. Like during the week, that's what you do. But on Shabbat, this is who you are, right? It's your essence. And it's a haven from the rest of the world. And that's what the marriage is designed to be as well. This is who you are, meaning outside is maybe what you do, but this is your essence, and you're accepted exactly for you, who you are, and nothing more. What I'd like to do in the last few minutes is give you an interesting case, because the rabbis accept the position of the Torah, obviously, that this adultery, especially as it leads to mamzerut, is devastating. But at the same time, they have halachic concerns about not allowing the impact of mamzerut to spread too far. And it's a fine line, because on one hand, the Torah's very high level of punishment, the mamzer, who is punished in so many different ways, prevents, in a society like an ancient society, prevents people from perhaps committing adultery, because what is more precious to you than your child? So maybe you would be tempted, but you'll overcome your temptation, either if you're like Yosef, who sees his father, or if you see your child, right? Very often we're motivated to do great things or to avoid bad things by connecting with other people. There's an amazing story of this guy who was traveling in the, I can't remember which mountain range it was. I think it was out west in Colorado. And he was about 5 miles from a road, and he broke his leg. And then, of course, it started to snow. And the snow's filling up, and he can't move, and he'll die from the freezing, and he'll just be covered. And he basically says he scoots himself out to the road. It's 5 miles. A scoot is, he's on his tuchus, and he just starts shimmering. And he does it he could do about 100 of these shimmers, and then he breaks, and he can't do it anymore, and he does it again. And he says it took him something like 2 or 3 days in order to get out there, but he saved his life only because he was able to do that. And they said, so how did you keep the ability to do that? He says he dedicated every one of those 100 things to a different person. He says, this one I'm now going to do for my child. This one I'm going to do for my daughter. This one I'm doing for my wife. This I'm doing for my parent. And the only thing that kept him going and motivated him was to begin to think about doing these very difficult activities in honor of someone else. And so we do that. And so the rabbis understood, the Torah understands that as terrible as the punishments of mamzerut are, maybe that will actually be a good deterrence, because people will care about what happens to their children. The rabbis, however, are mitlabet, are a little bit hesitant about that, because what about the child as well? So they try to live with both the high level of deterrence, but the low level of actual implementation. We have the same thing with capital punishment, right? There's a lot of capital punishment in the law books. You'll get stoned, you'll get this. But in terms of practice, we know that the rabbis were always very careful about actually implementing it. Yeah.
I think because people are supposed to feel like, what does this child do? Why
Yeah.
does this child be punished?
It seems unfair, exactly. Right, so that's, I think it's connected to the idea of, as a deterrent factor, because nothing, perhaps, can really deter you at this moment of, sort of physical, temptation, but maybe a connection to something, a child or a parent, maybe that could sort of wake you up out of it at that point in time. So one of the ways you sort of a prism by which you could see the rabbi's concern to avoiding mamzerut is an interesting case that happened here in Israel in 1994. So it happened in Beersheba. There was a woman who was in the hospital giving birth to a child. And the case was that the woman had not been with her husband, says the husband, for 10 months. They actually got divorced during the pregnancy. And he says, this child, there's no way this child is mine. The wife says, it's true, we haven't been together, but I still think it's, I don't know how she knows biology or not, but they still think it's his child. They're getting divorced. They make an agreement that when the child is born, we'll put the matter to rest. We'll take a DNA test, and that will be the end of the story.
Take a what?
A DNA test
Oh.
to see whose child it is. So the child is born. The parents ask the hospital to do the DNA test. They start to draw blood, and the Attorney General of the State of Israel steps in and says, I will not allow you to take blood and do the DNA test. The parents say, what are you talking about? There's the two of us say it's okay. The Attorney General says, I have an obligation to protect the interests of the child. If you do the DNA test, there's a chance you're going to prove that the child is a mamzer. The mamzer now has a whole series of negative ramifications for that child in terms of who they can get married to. By the way, he also uses secular arguments in terms of child support, in terms of, is this father going to be obligated or not obligated? There's precedence to this. For example, there was a father who once wanted to take his child off his Teudat Zehut because he felt that it wasn't his child. And the state did not allow him to do that because it would have negative ramifications for the child. So the parents go to court, and they win in court because they say it's true that the child has certain rights, but who is supposed to represent the children's rights? Not the Attorney General, but the parents. And so the parents say this is in his interest, we let him do it. So they go back, get the needle ready again, to do it again. This time the child is obviously much older because it was a long court case. Attorney General goes up to the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court, one of the justices was an individual by the name of Menachem Alon. Menachem Alon is a, judge in the Supreme Court. He's one of the founders of Mishpat Ivri, the movement to try to get halacha to influence secular law. And so he writes a case, and he actually comes up with an interesting proof text. He tells another wild case. He tells the case of Elazarov, Chaim Elazarov. You know Chaim Elazarov? We have a lot of streets named after Chaim Elazarov. You lived on Elazarov. So do you know who Elazarov was? He was killed on the beaches in Tel Aviv. He was negotiating the week before with Germans about how many Jews to rescue. This is in the 38, I think, something like that. And he comes back, and he's a representative of the Jewish agency. He's called a traitor. He is walking the streets with his wife, Sima, on the beaches of Tel Aviv at night. And he's stopped by these two individuals, and he's shot right there on the street. On the beach. We don't know who the people are, who did it, but we have an eyewitness of Sima, who says when they eventually find these two people, Avram Stavsky and Tzvi Rosenblatt, who were both members. The reason why they thought they might be involved is they were members of not just Jabotinsky's revisionist movement, but the extreme group within Jabotinsky's group. Jabotinsky himself, denied any involvement, and he rejected the two of them completely. Anyway, there was a trial, there's a court case. By the way, an aside of this whole thing, Elazarov didn't die right away. He actually was brought up to Jerusalem to the hospital, and one of the doctors says it was neither Stavsky or Rosenblatt who killed him. By the way, I'll get to that in a moment. It was the hospital that killed him. At the time, I don't want to be negative against any hospital, but I think it was Bikor Cholim. They said that they had a terrible treatment. They could have saved him and he would have lived. And it was actually after that Hadassah Hospital, this doctor who felt the hospital was so poor, started encouraging the development of Hadassah Hospital in response to the inability to save Chaim Elazarov's life. So at this point in time, there was in prison an Arab comes and says, it was me. I did it. So it creates a certain amount of doubt. Stavsky and Rosenblatt get off, even though Sima identifies one of them as the actual person. They believe the Arab was lying. He was already on death row. So later, years later, he recants and says he was paid by one of the families of Stavsky or Rosenblatt to say what he said. Anyway, there's a lot of court cases back and forth. They are found innocent on a technicality. And of course, what happens? The first Shabbat afterwards, they go to shul. Stavsky gets Stavsky gets an aliyah. half the shul gets up and says, Kol hakavod. Half the shul gets up and throws their chairs at him. The shul ends that, they don't finish the Torah reading. There's a whole big fight, everything like that. There is sort of a cosmic, I don't know if it's justice or cosmic irony of something to that effect. Oh, you know this. The Altalina has it, and I think it's Stavsky or Rosenblatt, I don't remember which one, is actually killed in the Altalina affair on the Tel Aviv beach, 50 meters from where Chaim Lazaroff was shot originally. What does all this have to do with our case? So, over the years, people sued, the families of Lazaroff would sue Rosenblatt and Stavsky, and they passed away, and then their families, saying that you were found innocent, but only on a technicality. Everyone knows you're really guilty. And so the family sued and says, that's not fair. We were found innocent. It's not fair now for there to be all this statement. So Begin suggests, Menachem Begin suggests, let's have a national inquiry, right? This is now in the 1980s. It's enough already. We'll find out what really happened. He puts,
Who's in the Altalina? I think that way.
yeah, Begin. So he said, we're going to find out everything that happens. The families of Stavsky and Rosenblatt sue Menachem Begin and say, you can't have, the court already made a decision, you can't have another court. Menachem Alone's response to this is, there's such a thing called truth, factual truth, and halachic truth. He says, they may or may not be innocent, they may or may not be guilty, and it may have just been a technicality. But a technicality in the courts is what we call halachic, or in this case, legal truth. So we don't care what happens outside of the courts in terms of truth. What is he saying in that regard? He says, for example, we have interests in lawyer-client privilege. We have interest in doctor-patient privilege. We want patients to share information with their doctors for their health. We have interest in spousal protection, that a wife can't testify against her husband or vice versa, because we want to encourage, there's an interest in having these people, the husband and wife, to be able to share with one another. So the court says, we're going to turn a blind eye, even if we could really force the lawyer to turn in his client, or the husband to turn in his wife, or vice versa. We're going to turn a blind eye. We don't want to know that truth, because we have a different truth in operation right now, which is the system that will produce, hopefully, the best results. This happens in halacha as well. If the rabbis say, there was a case once where someone sold non-kosher meat in Chicago, and the rabbis had given approval and said that it was kosher. So retroactively, they said, did you eat non-kosher food? And the answer was, factually you did, but halachically you did not, because the rabbi said it was kosher. We have these That's an interesting question, which the machloket existed. Actually, some said you did not have to kasher your pots. Interesting. That may taking it to an extreme. I think everyone kashered the pots anyway, right? The point that Menachem Malone was making, however, is that there can be this concept of sort of objective truth, but once you enter into the court, there might be something else that's different. The rabbis made a similar decision, rabbis of old, with regards to giving certain preferences and precedents and presumptions with regards to mamzerut. For example, the rabbis say that if you hear a rumor that someone has committed an adulterous relationship, you automatically have to reject that rumor as a matter of law. We say the standard of evidence in sort of establishing mamzerut is the same standard of evidence with regards to dinei nefashot, right, capital cases, rather than dinei mamonot. We have another, for example, there's cases where a person would go away and be separated from their wife for a year, but if they were in the same city, we have a presumption that says they got together at some point in time during that year, even if they both deny it. We assume that they did. There's a whole series of different things. What? There's also issues of warning, and it's two warnings. In other words, the rabbis found all these different presumptions and said, that's part of how we define the truth in this matter. It's possible that this is a mamzer, but we have a legal interest in trying to avoid it, and they quote a wonderful midrash. Menachem Malone quotes this wonderful midrash about who says that the people are oppressed, and they have no one to comfort them, so I, God, will comfort them. And the midrash says, who are the people who are oppressed? It's the mamzerim. And who is doing the oppression? halacha. And who is doing the comforting? God. Meaning God will comfort the mamzerim who are being punished by halacha. He says, so in this regard, the rabbis are acting as God's representative and trying to find ways to protect in that regard. So he finds a way of creating this balance of protecting the mamzerut, even though we understand the larger case that it could be a danger. Okay.
So what's the meaning, what's the outcome?
The outcome is they did not allow them to do the test.
They did not
Did not allow them to do the DNA test.
I didn't get the end of it.
Did not.
Allow what?
The DNA test.
Oh, they did not.
He said, nope.
Not them,
Alone. That was his decision.
that was it, Judge.
Yeah.
Hi,
Hi.
I know